I'm Joel Moses, and once again, I welcome PHSNE members and friends to join us in a live Zoom presentation about the working environment in industrialized New England. Before we get underway, if you are not already a PHSNE member, please consider joining our society to take advantage of the learning opportunities being made available by our dedicated members. A link to membership sign up is available on our website and is half price for the first year. If you have friends who share your interest in photography and images, please encourage them to consider membership. I will now ask Dana G. to make the formal introduction for today's topic.
Thanks, Joel. Hi, I'm Dana G. I'm the program coordinator for PHSNE. Before we get started, I just have a few quick announcements. We're doing Zoom meetings until further notice, and details about upcoming meetings will be at the end of the Q&A after this talk, or you can view the snapshots newsletter at phsne.org. And I'm going to post a link in the chat where you can sign up to do a show and tell slot at our December meeting. So that link will be in the chat if you'd like to participate. And if you're new to Zoom, if you move your cursor to the bottom left, that's where you control video and audio. Please stay muted during the presentation with the red line through your mic. Center of the screen at the bottom, you'll see chat, where you can open a chat window and type a question for Steve as the presentation is going, and we will read those at the end. So just type your question in the bottom of the chat window. If you have any technical difficulties, you can post those there too. I'll try and help with that. Just please use the default everyone recipient so that we can all see your questions, and we'll get to those at the end. As for our presenter, Steve Dunwell makes photographs of New England, people, landscape, and industry for publications, collectors, and advertising. Industrial history has been a primary interest for Steve throughout his professional career. His photos of mills and workers helped create the National Park in Lowell and the Industrial Museum in Waltham. Inspired by Hein and others, Steve took his camera into dozens of textile mills in New England in the early 1970s. His photographs, combined with historical research and interviews with the mill workers he met, was published as The Run of the Mill by Godine Press in 1978. Steve also works on corporate and editorial assignments, concentrating on architecture and aerials. His regional images are published by Back Bay Press. His photographs are included in numerous corporate and private collections, as well as museums and libraries. He lives in Boston, where he formerly taught at NESOP and now teaches photography workshops through Digital Photo Academy. So join me in welcoming Steve. Take it away, Steve. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana, for that excellent introduction. I appreciate it. Muted me. Okay. So let me just check. Sound check is okay? Sounds good. Okay. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. And I especially appreciate this opportunity to make this presentation to PHSNE. I think you're a very interesting group, and I'm glad to have the audience that I have today. This will be a fun and interesting presentation, I'm sure. I want to start with a brief disclaimer. I am a professional photographer. I am not a professional historian of photography. And so while I'll be talking about a variety of historical situations and themes, there are other people who know more about this than I, and if you want to go further, I encourage you to dig deeper into that. Also, I'm sure that there will be lots of interesting Q&A at the end, so put your questions into the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation, and there'll be plenty of time to address all of that. So having done that, I'm going to switch over to share screen mode. And let's go in here. I've got to hold on just a sec. I'm going to wake up my keynote. Okay. I think I still have to just reshare one more time. Just hold on, please. going to share from there. Now I can see it. It's good. We're going to share Keynote and we're going to play slideshow. Okay. So we'll start here. Bing. All good. Now, the pictures I'll be showing you are images that show the industrial history of textile manufacturing in New England. A lot of this work was developed during a project that I was working on in the 1970s, but the early history goes way back. I want to quickly remind you of what that history looked like. The New England textile industry was the first place where New England workers started going into factories and worked with machines, which were very new to that environment then. Prior to that, people would do things by hand in their homes. So the whole idea that you would come to a factory and work with a machine was a very new idea in the 1780s and 90s when it was first pioneered. And then there was a period of several decades while the industry developed. It grew, there were more machines, bigger machines, larger workforces, larger factories, all developing around the general geography of water power, such that the typical mill was situated either on top of or adjacent to a river that would provide water power to run the machines. And within a matter of decades, almost every significant water power opportunity in New England had been occupied by mills of different sizes. In some cases, these mills were kind of small, like these ones in Rhode Island. Typically, they would have a few hundred workers and they might have to build a village nearby. That was very common in Rhode Island and Connecticut. Or sometimes at much larger water powers, like in Lowell and Manchester, New Hampshire, you would find much bigger developments that had larger workforces, often tens of thousands of people, and a much bigger investment in capital and machinery, and of course, correspondingly larger output. But within a couple decades after this early beginning, this optimistic beginning, the situation started to get a lot darker. This part of that was driven by changes in the labor force, the increasing immigration. This image by Winslow Homer gives you kind of a feeling for that. It's no longer being portrayed as being such a optimistic and possibly even utopian situation, but it's more a situation where the role of labor and the power of capital is really highlighted. So during this time, though, it's helpful to remember that a lot of situations about the way people worked were considered very routine, including the frequent use of children in factories. Here's a banknote from the 1870s that shows, like right in the center, that they thought, this is great. Of course, the children are working in the factory. Something that we would think now would be, absolutely impossible to conceive of. At that time, it was kind of typical, especially in these smaller factories and especially in these dispersed villages around New England, Rhode Island, Connecticut, parts of New Hampshire, parts of Massachusetts. So along the same time, photography itself was developing. Having started in the 1840s, by the time we get to the 1860s and 1870s, photography was rather sophisticated. This image on the left shows two weavers in a tintype. You can tell they're weavers because they're holding their shuttles. There's a kind of a classic image there. The one on the right shows women who are sorting silk for the silk industry in Manchester. So decade by decade, the industry got more sophisticated, and also the way that it was being represented got more sophisticated. One of the biggest companies was Paniatowski in Manchester, New Hampshire, on the Merrimack River. And Paniatowski had its own in-house photo program, which produced quite a wonderful archive of images that are intriguing even now. The one on the left is really one of the best that shows what a mill yard would look like. And the one on the right, of course, is bringing the cotton in, and the bales and the horses and the carriages and all that. So these things were developing along kind of simultaneously. You had, on the one hand, the growth of the industry and the change in its workforce. increasing immigration decade by decade. You had the changes in photography as it became more sophisticated, more commonplace, a wider range of cameras and camera techniques, shifting from wet collodion towards dry plate, things like that. And also there were changes in journalism itself. And I wanted to highlight one really important person in this sequence, who was Jacob Riis. His book was called How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, focused entirely on Lower Manhattan, especially on the Lower East Side, around Hester Street, that kind of thing. And he was one of the first people, in fact, just about the first person, to take his camera into the homes of ordinary people, especially ordinary working people, and to use magnesium flash to make photographs that actually showed how people were living. It was completely revolutionary. No one had done this before. And also he was able to bring these pictures together and put them into a book. That was also a new thing, to be able to print a photograph in a book and distribute it in this way. So his work was really quite revolutionary. And the images that he was able to make were quite surprising also. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that he also worked or met with and sometimes was a colleague of Teddy Roosevelt, who had a similar interest in exploring the sort of the underclasses of Manhattan in one of his early jobs there. So Riis took his magnesium flash into these places and made photographs that were really quite surprising, showing how people were living, working in these kind of sweatshop environments and publishing them and bringing that information into the public eye. That was in the 1890s. Not quite 20 years later, this amazing photographer, Louis Hein, comes along with a different set of goals, different set of tools, and a special focus on child labor. By the time he started doing his child labor work, it was 1908. He had done some work before that involving, I'm going to go back one year, involving Ellis Island. I'll come to that in just a sec. And he came into this through his work as a teacher in a series of schools in New York that were called Ethical Culture. He was part of that ethical culture group and really was a crusading pioneer type person. He first went to Ellis Island in 1905, did some photographs there. In fact, he took some of his school classes there. And then in 1908, he started working for the National Child Labor Committee. And as you can see here, he went on a series of other photographic assignments. I'll come back to that in just a moment. I wanted to show you the kinds of pictures that he started taking because he also was a revolutionary photographer. One of the key features was that he started to take a sort of occupy a zone between candid work and sort of stylized and controlled work. He really tried to put people into the photographs in a way that made them the center of the picture. The person is the center, often just one person, and to show the environment that they were in. Other examples of that included the work that he was doing in the textile mills. And my belief is that this is the camera that he was using at the time. This was a Autograph-Lex from 1907. Obviously, you look down into it. The camera is designed to take either glass plates, or later it could be modified to take what we'd now call a film holder. And it was a reflex camera, meaning you look down into a mirror and the mirror shows what the lens is seeing. So there's an image of Hein many decades later holding that camera and showing a little bit of how it would work. Well, one of the key features of this camera is that you're using it at waist height. It's primarily a waist chest level kind of camera. And that really suited the work that he was doing for the National Child Labor Committee starting in 1908. And it went on, he did that pretty much continuously for about 10 years. During this time, his goal was to show the conditions in factories, especially textile mills, but he went to a lot of other places, and especially to highlight the fact that children were working in these factories and that this was not only illegal, but it was bad for the kids themselves. It was unhealthy, it was unsanitary, the conditions weren't safe. And so he was trying to dramatize those conditions with his photographs. One of the ways he did that was to either go inside a mill, if he could get permission to do that, or to wait outside, like in this kind of situation, where he would come when the workday began, take pictures of people waiting to go in, and later come back at the end of the workday when they were coming out. In each case, very often he would put one person in the center. He would have kind of an environment around it. And sometimes that person, actually quite often, that person would be looking right at the camera. We call that eye contact. It really gives you a sense of character, and it kind of focuses your attention on that one person. So part of his technique was to use that low camera angle and the eye contact to make the pictures have more impact, and to also dramatize the fact that these were children working next to machines, and the machines were bigger than the children. So by having that camera low, you dramatize that. I'll show you a little bit later how that changes when you move the camera around. But his point of view was always designed to show that the children were the focus, and the story was about children working with machines in these factories. He also took notes as he went along, and when you read the notes, you get a feeling for the crusade, the feeling of a concerned, committed, highly motivated photographer. One of the collections that I was able to find has his actual note cards as part of the collection. So you can see his handwriting, you can see his typing. He must have traveled with a small typewriter because he would type these things up. Once again, looking at this image on the left, Mamie Lafarge, under legal age was the caption for this one. And see how low the camera is. The camera's only at about, what's at her waist height. It's probably about 30 inches up, something like that. Very likely he's using a tripod, partly because the light levels in these mills were kind of low, and you would have to use a tripod if you possibly could to get a picture that was sharp enough to be worth hanging on to. I'm going to read you a couple other comments that went with some of these pictures to give you a feeling for his point of view. So Mamie, under legal age. Adrienne Paniette. So first he met her in the mill, then he later went to her home. When he met her in the mill, if you look at the caption down at the end, it says, stooping, reaching, and pushing heavy boxes is bad for young girls, adolescent. Then he followed her home and made a picture of her family. That's her in the kind of plaid, would you say gingham? Not sure exactly. That's her in the front right. And this is her family. And the caption here goes, entire family of 17 members, 8 or 10 of them in the mill, almost all of them illiterate. Another example, oops, wrong way, sorry about that, was this one. The caption reads, slovenly kitchen living room of family of Alfred Benoit, a sweeper in the Bennett mill. And then he goes on to talk about the kids and how their clothes were dirty and things like that. Here's another example. He did quite a few of these. It was the type would be called the young spinner or the little spinner. In this particular case, he says, one of the little spinners at Amaskik. She was about 48 inches high and about 11 or 12 years old. He measured height by counting the buttons on his jacket and guessed about their ages. But notice also that he's got the kid kind of in the center and also near a window. I'll come back to that a little bit because this business of posing near a window is a major factor in the way that he did his work. Here we have Dora Stainers, who was in Atlanta, and the caption starts off, began spinning at 7 years old. In this mill, 32 years, only 4 days of schooling in her life. So you get this feeling for how he was a focused, motivated crusader, really. And he really wanted to show the conditions of children and to educate the general population about how this was not only rampant, but it was a really bad idea. So he was always kind of pushing on that axis. Here's another group of kids. Obviously, they are what were called sweepers. That was their job. I have a feeling he might have said, you know, would you guys all go over there and, you know, do a little thing with your brooms, because the brooms really make the picture a whole lot more interesting. So this was the kind of thing he was doing. The picture on the left is one of his. The picture on the right is a postcard. Here you can compare a little bit the difference between documentary photography that he was doing on the left, where there's a very kind of an informal feeling, a you are there feeling, again, very low camera, and the postcard, which is clearly a promotional photograph. Everyone is cleaned up. The guys got their suspenders. Their hair is just so. The women are looking sort of cheerful, perched on the loom. But you can see how the environment is also about, it's quite similar. They're on the top floor of the mill because it has skylights, which makes it brighter and easier to make a photograph. And on the right, they've cleaned everything up. On the left, they haven't. Noticed also the barefoot child. So he's always looking for these elements to help dramatize his point of view. Okay, I mentioned that frequently the camera's really low, but every now and then he would move the camera up. And as these machines typically are about 5.5 feet high. You can just barely see over them if you're my height. Of course, as a child, you wouldn't. So once you get up above, if you can stand on something, maybe a ladder or something like that, or stand on a platform, then you can see what the whole room looks like. And this was something that he did occasionally, but not too much. For one thing, the kids don't look as small. It doesn't really dramatize their size as much when you're above as when you're below. So occasionally he would do these room views, but not too much. More often, he would bring the camera down low, really low, and show really how young these kids are. So he was always trying to move in that direction, to dramatize child labor. Who did he work for? National Child Labor Committee. So that's his goal. And reminded me a little bit of the Willie Sutton rule of bank robbing. You go where the money is. Well, photographers learn early on to go where the photographs are. And one of the issues in photographing in these mills is that they really are quite dark. The picture this is a before and after picture from an electrical trade journal in 1926. The point they were trying to make is, oh, look, we put new light bulbs into the mill and now you can see how much better it is. So it's before on the left and after on the right. Well, the before situation, that's the world that Louis Hein was working in. These places are really dark most of the time. And so he would very often move to the windows because that's where the light is. Or maybe the top floor, because the top floor is always better lighted because they would have kind of like skylights and things up there. So one thing he did was to very frequently concentrate on stay near the windows or move the kids over to the windows, but that was a more productive situation. Also, he was always looking for children, and children were most frequently used in spinning. Remember, weaving is a whole other animal. The textile manufacturing business includes carding and picking and spinning and beaming and weaving and perching and the whole series of other jobs that go into this and types of machines. But the spinning mill or the spinning machines is one category. Spinning machines are a little bit less dangerous than looms are, and they are easier to tend and better suited to a young unskilled worker. So by concentrating on spinning, he also was looking where the kids were, because that's where the kids were. They were in the spinning room, not so much in the weave shed, which would be another part of the place. Also, when you're in a spinning room, there's not as much vibration. It's mostly a rotary movement, and it just kind of hums, and so the floor doesn't rock around that much. It's more possible to to work in an environment that's not too noisy and not too where the vibration's not too much. Contrary-wise, if you go to a weaving room or a weaving mill, there's a tremendous amount of reciprocating motion, and the floors vibrate like crazy, and it's extremely noisy. So, and a lot more dangerous also. The weaving environment is more typically adults, and the spinning environment in this case was frequently children. So he would go into those spinning rooms and go over to the windows and keep the camera low and make these kind of pictures. These become classic Lewis Hein photographs. The one on the left is an especially well-known image of his, and you can see how it's just the window light. He's let the rest of the room go dark there. Okay, so then later he goes up to Amiskig in Manchester. Amiskig was this huge mill complex on the Merrimack River, and he was able to go inside sometimes. We've seen some of those. He also was outside doing this, going to work or coming back from work. This is another really famous image of his. And notice how he's got like one central figure, he's coming at you. There's a really clear expression. There's a lot of vitality to it. The kid looks kind of like, hey, happy to get out of there maybe. And everyone is also rather dressed up. You wonder how that worked out, but it has a real candid kind of a feeling to it. While he was in Manchester, he also he went into the factories, he went out, he waited, did all those things. I wanted to just show you, by contrast, an image that was taken by the management of the Amiskig mills. I'll go back a little bit. So this is Lewis Hein's rather candid photograph, probably handheld, low camera angle, with some motion and a real feeling of you are there. And then this is like the company photograph, more like a portrait of the overseer of the worsted room, 1914, about the same time that Hein was doing that kind of work. From there, he went down to New Bedford. He was there several times, but in one particular visit, he did a whole series of these workers in New Bedford, sometimes on the street, sometimes in the mills, but he started to move into more classic kind of compositions, central figure, and a lot of eye contact. You know, here it's like the eye contact really makes those pictures work. Again, kind of a low camera angle so that the kids seem more imposing. Then he would follow them home, photograph using magnesium flash, you know, get the entire family together. And a similar thing that he was doing in some of the Rhode Island mill villages as well. So he was following these people home, doing those home portraits, and using flash when he was indoors. I might add, by the way, parenthetically, that to my eye, to use that flash apparatus in someone's home must have been really kind of shocking in a way. You put this powder in, you set it off, and you know, small explosion goes off, and you make your picture, and then everyone probably looks around and says, what the heck happened? And how did we let that guy in here? You know, it's really a rather intrusive process, but that's what he did. And it seemed to have worked, as he was able to make these very detailed photographs of what these apartments were like. Finally, he was able to find a few places where he actually thought that the factory was managed in a more effective way. One of those was the Cheney Silk Mill in Manchester, where he did a whole series of these called favorable working conditions. Each photograph has the same caption: favorable, favorable, favorable. Again, he's got eye contact, and he's not trying to like show them in a disadvantageous way. They have a lot of presence to them. That was one thing he was doing. Then in 1918, he went to France for the Red Cross, worked there for a while, photographing their operations. But one result of that was this one photograph that actually shows him on the job. It's the only one I've been able to find. So there he is up there on the left. You can see he's got that Graflex kind of camera looking down. You see it's got a kind of a place where your face would go, like you're looking down into this sort of a pyramid thing. And also notice he's got a leather kind of carrying case on his hip, and that would carry the film holders that he was using. My guess is you could fit maybe, I don't know, 8 or 10 film holders into something like that. I'm a little uncertain about how many and he would carry with him, and also how he would process them when he was in a faraway place, which he often was. These are questions maybe we'll talk about later, but the whole thing of like, how did he really work? How many plates could you expose in a day? How do you develop them at night? How do you prevent them from breaking? All that kind of stuff. It's really quite something to try to figure that out. And maybe some of you can help me out on that. So that's what he did in France. Then he came back, and at the latter part of his career, he was working in a series of situations that involved corporate construction. Some of it was big dynamos and turbines and things like that. And another part involved the Empire State Building construction. But when he was doing this series, you can see how he's actually constructing a photograph more deliberately. Of course, this is completely centered, radially symmetrical, radial, radial, radial. And I can tell you for sure, as speaking as a person who's done quite a bit of corporate photography, when you get into a situation like this, the photographer, like me, like him, says, whoa, we could make a pretty good picture out of this. He's kind of set it up. And then you say, excuse me, sir, would you go over there and pretend to measure the diameter of that bearing there? And the guy goes over and says, yeah, kind of like this. And say, yes, exactly like that. And that's how you would make that picture. And that sets up another image, very, very famous picture of his, sometimes called the steam fitter or something like that. The final image is the one on the left. On the right, you can see a couple of different variations on this. And when you think about it, on the one hand, this is a terrific picture. It's a really strong image. It has great geometry, and it shows this guy being so muscular, and it has a lot of positive elements. You can also see how it's quite contrived. It's like, please go over there, grab this wrench, put it on that thing, turn it this way, give it a try. We'll try again. So that's kind of how you'd make that sort of a photograph. But it's a very, very successful one. And I wouldn't diminish his accomplishment one iota, but just let you know a little bit about what goes on behind the scenes of how to take this picture. Also, you can tell by the shape of the negatives that this is done with a 5x7 camera. He worked sometimes with 4x5, but this particular one is a 5x7. Okay, so henceforth, all the photographs you'll be seeing are from my work in the 1970s. I knew about Mr. Hein's work before then. I had had some contact with other documentary photographers, and I had kind of developed a sense that that was the way I wanted my career to go. I was in my early 20s and had a few years of work experience after college, but not too much. And some of that involved photography, and I was still learning a lot about photography at that time. And I was really very, very fortunate to meet a person who owned a textile mill in Fall River. His name was Alan Simons. He invited me to come to his company. It was called Providence Pile Fabric, and he owned a rather large textile mill in Fall River. And he had a couple of secondary mills. One was in Woonsocket and another one was in Philadelphia. So he said, come on over, take a look. And when I stepped into that environment, I was immediately astonished at what I was seeing, and very quickly became extremely interested in the subject matter. And I really, really liked the people that I was meeting. So a variety of things were happening simultaneously. One was the experience of being in the mill and seeing the environment, which is noisy and chaotic and filled with all kinds of crazy machines, but also meeting the people and talking to them and taking note of what they said to me. So very early on, I started to make notes and write down what they said. And this man, Joe Paniatowski, was one of the first people that I met. One of the first people I really was able to photograph in a way that kind of gave me a feeling for what could be done. And this is a quote from what he said to me and what I was able to write down. My wife says I'm a sloppy man, but when it comes to weaving, I just like to look at yards and yards of perfect cloth. It's very difficult to do, and that's what I strive for. My job is looking for trouble and eliminating it. That's how I get my satisfaction. All my life, my whole object was to make a piece of cloth that was perfect continuously. That's Joe. He was a sample weaver. And his loom was a little smaller than some of the others. And the position of it was such that I could kind of get the camera down at the end of the loom. So you're looking right down what we call the shed, which is where the shuttle travels. And that was part of my learning process, was like, where can you go? Where can you stand safely? Where can you put the camera? And by the way, this is a case where if the shuttle was not trapped properly, it would go right into the camera because it comes right at you that way. So Joe was one of the first people that I met. Leo Miranda, same factory, a loom fixer. Also, someone who was able to explain to me a little bit about what he did, how he did it, that kind of thing. And as I was doing this, I also started to think about how to compose the pictures and what kind of a camera to use. And early on, I at first had started out using 35mm because that's what I knew at the time. However, very soon after beginning this work in Fall River, I switched to 6x6 film and I started using the Hasselblad. We'll come to that in just a sec. There it is. I was using the 500C. I have one right here. I still have it. There it is right there. It has a pop-up viewfinder, just like that. And I had two lenses for it. I had the 50mm Distagon and the 80mm planar. I might add, by the way, that I got into using this camera in part because I was talking to a friend of mine and I was saying, I really wish my pictures were kind of like had more detail in them and had a little bit more, of a formal quality. And he said, well, why don't you just try the Hasselblad? You might like it. So I got a used one and used it steadily throughout this project. Also, around the same time, I was very much influenced by some other extremely well-known luminaries in photography who were working with square format, especially Diane Arbus and Irving Penn. Irving Penn's World in a Small Room was a big influence on me. So the whole thing of composing in a square kind of gave the project a shape and also was a test for me because a square is harder to compose in. You just keep wondering, well, where can I put people and how can I do this? So I was kind of working along with this and trying to find new ways to make pictures and to meet new people and have, more experiences and so forth. This guy, John Valeriana, a weaver, said to me, when you get close to a loom, it sounds different. It comes to you the longer you're on. I can tell if it's functioning right just by the sound. Basically speaking, weaving isn't the worst job, but you've got to watch almost everything. I've been a weaver since '46. As it turns out, it was the best job I ever had. So, well, okay. I think that I'm impressed. And I really like the way these people presented themselves to the camera. So I was discovering a kind of a realm, a world with people and machines. I was using a particular camera, a particular point of view, and trying to find my way through that and recording stuff as I went along. This guy, Jose Souza, was a weaver, same factory, and I followed him home. And I said, okay. He said, come on home with me. Okay, fine. So I went there and I met his wife and his kid. And here I started using the Braun 515 electronic flash bounced on the ceiling as a way to light these interiors. Again, that was an area that I really didn't have much experience with, but I was groping my way along. And once again, this business of using flash indoors and making a picture that showed someone's home was kind of a new thing, new for me. And there weren't really that many people doing that either. So I was trying to grow in that direction also. That was the 515. And by the way, I still have it. That's what it looks like right there. 515. It was called that because it had a 515-volt battery. Back with Joe and his car, he's rocking with that car, man. Then similarly into other people's homes nearby, other workers. This was sort of my Bill Owens suburbia phase, trying out different ways of making pictures and different themes. Some of these went into the project eventually and some of them didn't. Back in the mill, back with these square format images, looking for other ways to kind of make the pictures continually interesting, not to do the same thing over and over again. But I kept meeting people really, really caught my eye, and just, I was just floored by the stuff they would say. This guy was at a place called Stamina Mills in Forestdale, Rhode Island, it was a classic small Rhode Island mill. And he said to me, "You can tell I'm a working man. I could retire, but I wouldn't think of it. I work 58 hours a week, and that means a lot of overtime. I own my own house, and I buy my cars new. I weld, I cut, I rig, you name it, I do it." Okay, I'm impressed, right. Also at Stamina, this is the card room. They're cleaning up. It looks messy, but that's because they're cleaning, right? Every now and then you stop the card, you try to clean it up. And by the way, these things are dangerous. Look at those exposed belts and all that, that hardware that you could literally get caught up in. And so the safety aspect was a big factor. Often the mill owners would say, yeah, you can walk around, but just stay out of trouble and try not to get hurt, okay? Sometimes the quietest places where they were checking for quality and fixing things that needed to be fixed. This is what Beatrice Rochefort was doing in this room in the top of the mill in Pasco. Same idea, a very similar job, a perch worker. Perch that's where you review the woven product near the end of it. It's a quality control thing. Another spinning environment. This is in Greystone. This place was called Worcester Textile. And it really just had these very, very long rows of machines. And when you're working in that environment, you typically get these converging perspectives that kind of all go in like that, especially if you're using a wide angle lens. Around this time, I also hooked up with another company called Arbica Webbing in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. I was connected to them through the Slater Mill. Arbica made a product that was kind of like ace bandages and things like that, narrow fabric. And I spent quite a few weeks going in and out of Arbica, looking at what they did, again, working with the square format, trying to show the different components of the process, that, and to make different kinds of compositions. This one always intrigued me. I like that little composition, the way everything kind of goes up to the top there. This is what's called a creel. It's where the threads are gathered in advance of putting them onto the beam. So a creel worker is tending the creel there. And it's a very interesting geometric kind of environment. This guy is he's cleaning a narrow fabric loom. That's why he's standing inside it. Obviously the machine is stopped. He has to kind of get all the mess out of there. And again, looking at the camera, giving that eye contact feeling, more eye contact in the creel. Around this time, I also started working with the CNRF, which was a 4x5 camera. I picked this up because I wanted to photograph the exteriors of these buildings as part of my project. And someone kind of said, well, why don't you consider the CNR? Okay. And one of the big features of that is that it had this wide angle bellows. You can see it on the right there. And the wide angle bellows allowed me to do these pictures where you're kind of looking up at the buildings, which was, like a sort of a novel thing for me. I was still exploring and kind of learning how you would do this. But when you're using a wide angle lens and you're not too far away from a building, sometimes you would want that rising front to be able to do that. I was also admiring the work of George Tice, who was working with kind of similar imagery in Paterson, New Jersey, and some other places. So this is kind of my George Tice phase. But it was also an opportunity to try to show like what the buildings look like from the outside. And these crazy towers and all the masonry and that kind of thing. The way sometimes the building would sit right on top of the river and the water would come right out through it. Very unusual, by the way. And you have to wonder, well, what happens in a flood? This thing could really blow out. But I was able to use that rig, the CNRF, the rising front, to do a lot of these exteriors. I was also exploring the idea of using very soft light because I couldn't really control the contrasty situation as well. So sometimes I'd go out and photograph in the sort of foggy situations or overcast situations. Again, rising front, Holyoke on the left, Fall River on the right. But eventually I went back to working with the square. That was my main tool for being inside these mills. I was very fortunate in meeting Ted Larder at the Wanalancet Mill in Lowell. That's Ted on the left, and the group shot way down in the left front. And he also said, yeah, come on over. You can photograph anything you want in my mill. Just stay out of trouble and don't get hurt. So I was there quite a bit and went into all the different, trades, the spinning, the weaving, the fixing, all that kind of thing, and did a series at Wanalancet that was very productive, added a lot to the body of work that I was developing along the way at that time. Because in this process, I kept looking for ways to publish. I was very fortunate in having an early and effective collaboration with David Godine at Godine Publishing. And he encouraged me in this work. He encouraged me to bring in history, and not only photo history, but especially history illustrated in other ways, and woodcuts and etchings, things like that. And also he encouraged me to move the subject out to cover all of New England. So I went up into Maine, up into New Hampshire. In Maine, I found one of the last companies that was running a machine that's called the Spinning Mule. There's some conjecture about why they call it that, but what it does is it moves back and forth. The mule operator walks backwards, then walks forwards as the spinning is done. It's primarily used in woolens. I also went into a braid mill in Pawtucket. That's what this place is. It's called Conrad Jarvis. This is an example too of high angle. Get the camera up. Here I found a kind of a catwalk. They climb up, take the camera up there, look down, and suddenly you can see how big the room is and how many machines are in that room. And again, it's an absolutely deafening racket in a place like this, with all those things moving simultaneously, each with hundreds of moving parts, totally crazy. So I was in New Hampshire, I was in Rhode Island, and then I figured I better go back to Maine. I'll take a look at Bates Fabric in Lewiston, because Lewiston was a huge center. And Bates said, yeah, you can go in there. Don't get hurt, right? So I was able to go to different parts of the Bates operation, and I found this spinning frame near a window, and it said, that looks kind of familiar to me. So I said, without really stating it clearly to myself, I was remembering these images that Hein had made 70 years earlier, well, 65 years earlier, maybe, using a very similar motif. The difference is that the woman on the left, her name is Alice, was cleaning the spinning frame sort of between gigs, because you can see all that mess on the floor. That isn't ordinarily how it would be, but she's cleaning it up. And if she's a woman maybe in her 50s, could be 60, not sure exactly. Whereas Hein was always focused on that child worker. But notice how similar the environment is. It really hadn't changed that much. So I thought that seems to work. Maybe I'll make that the cover of this book I'm working on, which became The Run of the Mill. It was published in 1978 by Godine Press, and is considered, a really good survey of this subject area. So that was the culmination of that body of work. But I wanted to just show you briefly what I was doing, what I looked like. There's me with my Hasselblad and my Omega enlarger in the late 70s, well, 77. Some of my heroes, Burke-White, Lang, Evans, August Sander, of course, Atshay, of course, Adams, and Studs Terkel's work with recording people's testimonies was really influential on me as well. So I was doing all of that. That's what I looked like at Arbica one day. And I wanted to close by reading a couple of lines from this guy that I met at Wanalancet, Lionel Turcotte. Again, you see a lot of French names there. He said, a textile mill always fascinated me. You have a certain amount of machinery to keep running. If you can do it, you're happy. You set your machines up and you watch them work for you. The less you work, the more money you're making. That's the way I like it. He was just one of many amazing people I met. It was a fantastic environment filled with amazing and wonderful people. And it was an honor for me to be there. So at that point, I'm going to close this presentation and open it up to chat and Q&A. And I hope that you found this interesting. And I love answering questions, so have at it, okay? There you go. I'm going to go jump out of the screen share. Is that the right thing to do? I think it might be. Okay, there we are. Hey, John.
Hey, Steve, how are you? What terrific work.
Hey, thanks.
Really. It's just so thoughtful. You shoot from the heart, made beautiful, beautiful pictures. It's just a treat for me to look at the work and hear you talk about it. I mean it. It's really wonderful.
Well, that's a very encouraging remark coming from a colleague. John Goodman is a highly accomplished photographer, and we've been friends for a long time. So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so happy that I stumbled upon this email and was able to, and didn't miss it. Usually I stumble across it and it happened 4 hours ago, but I got you this time and it was great.
Thank you so much. I want to ask Dana, what have you got going in the chat, Dana?
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. That was marvelous. And thanks, John, for sending a greeting. We have a few questions. Andrew Barr said that he got an answer to his question, which was, did you ever use large format? But Andrew, if you want to pronounce the second half of your question, it says, did you ever shoot for HABS HAER?
Yeah, Habs hair.
Habs hair.
Yes, the answer is yes. Well, actually, yes, and well, indirectly. Let me put it this way. I'm very familiar with the HABS HAER. Those initials spell the American Engineering Record, historic American Engineering Record.
Yes.
And some of the work that I did in Waltham was specifically formatted for them. This was a government agency. It might have been affiliated with the Smithsonian, I'm not sure exactly, but their job was to record historic archaeological, industrial situations wherever they found them. Often there was a reason for recording it. The place was about to go out of business, or it's going to be demolished, or we're going to fix it up, or something like that. So the work I did in Waltham with Mike Folsom was part of that archive. I was not a photographer in the HABS system. They worked exclusively with 4x5, and their negatives had to be processed to a very high standard. You know, you must wash it for 30 minutes, 20 minutes isn't enough, you know, that kind of thing. You must put it in an envelope made with this material, not another material. So those were things that other people were doing. I didn't do so much of that, but I'm very familiar with it. Also, as you see, I did do a fair amount of 4x5, especially exteriors. We're using a 4x5 inside a mill, I think is nuts, unless it's stopped. If there's just too much vibration, it's not going to work. If you go when it's closed, well, then you could do some interesting things, but not while the machines are running and not while people are moving around. What I found was that I was using Tri-X, exposed usually at ASA 320, and a typical exposure for me would be about, you know, f5.6 at 1/10 of a second, something like that. And at that type of a shutter speed, you don't want people moving around too much. If you wanted a creative blur, it'd be something different. But if you want a sharp picture, you have to either wait for them to stop, or you just can't go to a slower speed. And in 4x5, that's a really big factor. So I use 4x5 exteriors, not so much interiors. I tried a few residential interiors with 4x5. Again, that was my Bruce Davidson phase. And I found that to be extremely difficult. And I didn't go too far down that road. Other people have been more successful. Another question?
Yes, from Reich wants to know, he would like to ask you about August Sander and his types.
Oh, August Sander is a great hero of mine. He was totally amazing. For those of you who don't know his work, he was photographing in Germany during the Weimar period. And his pictures were kind of portraits of kind of like interesting people. So he had this whole thing of like, I'm going to find, you know, the most amazing baker, the most amazing bicycle messenger, the artist, the architect, the musician, the chocolate maker. And so he would photograph these types. His pictures very often had a dominant figure in the center, kind of like a portrait, but in an environmental setting. Very powerful work. I highly recommend it to anyone who is wants to follow this further. August Sander, S-A-N-D-E-R, totally amazing man. And one or two of his photographs are among the most highly prized photographs around. There's this guy with a big pot stirring the, I forget what it is, baking or chocolate, I forget, but anyway, that's a very, very famous picture. Next question. Should I read them or should you? How do you want to do this?
Well,
You read, Dave.
there's one from Marty who's sending you a personal hello. Marty, do you want to say hi?
Could that be Mickey?
No, this is Marty Hassel from
Oh,
NISA.
hey, Marty.
How are you doing? When I heard it was you, I had to come. I'm glad you're still cooking and you haven't lost your teaching chops. That's what I wanted you to know. You're still really good at it.
Oh, that's encouraging. Thanks.
And I was wondering where you did your research for Reese and Hein. You mentioned a collection for Hein.
One of the primary sources for me was a book on Lewis Hein by Judith Mara Gutman. It's called Lewis Hein and the Social Conscience. I will reach over and I'll put it here. I'll show you, okay? That is the cover right there.
Okay, yep,
Little spinner, right there she is.
yeah.
And I got that book, very early in this process, probably in the early 70s, really before I had really started my journey. And so I always had this kind of work in mind. Mr. Hein had been a hero of mine for a long time. So I mentioned very quickly Hein, Sander, Penn. Irving Penn's Worlds in a Small Room really made a big impression on me also. He was working with the square camera. He used the Rolleicord primarily for those. I think partly because it was easier to carry around and even simpler. So he worked with the Rollie and worked in the square format, but he had that same idea of putting one person in the center of the picture, maybe two, but usually not very many, and trying to make it look classic. And I loved those pictures, and it was a big influence on me.
Thank you.
Should we move on to another question? What do you think?
Sure. David Starkman has a question. David, do you want to ask it yourself? Do you want me to read it?
Okay, I'll ask it. The older photos, I think it's I forget the photographer, but the ones of the children near the window and the spinning machine, and then your newer photo, the similar setup. The machines look so similar. I'm wondering, were the machines in the 70s, did they go back to the 1900s, or were they newer machines, or were they still using these really ancient machines?
That's a really good question, David. You bring up a good point. One of the reasons why these pictures harken back to an earlier time is because the machines are in fact very old. Almost all of remember, when I was doing this in the 70s, this was the declining phase of an industry that had been very successful up until about the 20s or so. New England textiles really started to decline shortly after World War I, but they kind of limped on into the 20s and 30s, and each decade, the population went down, the number of workers, the number of machines, but the factories remained in place, and very often the machines remained in place because they were built to run almost forever, and these manufacturers typically just ran them into the ground. That was part of the problem with New England manufacturing, textile manufacturing in general, was that there was almost no investment in new equipment. They were perfectly happy to take a machine that could be 60 or 70 or 80 years old and use the same parts and the same frame and just change a couple gears, and if something wore out, well, we'll fix it a little bit. And they were really using sometimes the exact same machine, or it might be a machine that had been made, let's say in 1930, but it was made on the pattern that had not changed. Follow me?
Yeah,
So
and also
look exactly the same.
I was also surprised by the sheer size of the rooms and the number of machines, like with that spinning machine, I assume that's just spinning thread, right?
Correct.
And the volume of thread they're producing is just phenomenally huge. It's just
Yes.
amazing to see it.
Yes, that's a very good point, and you're absolutely right. It takes a lot of thread
I
to run,
guess.
to run this kind of an industry. You have to remember that up until about the 1880s and 1890s, virtually every yard of cloth in America was made in New England.
Uh-huh.
It was the industry was very highly localized in New England, primarily running on water power, because we had the water power. We got there first. We had the Slater Mill. We had, Paul Moody and the machine shops, and everything was very concentrated in the Northeast. Maybe we'd extend down into like Philadelphia, a little bit of that, but there really was nothing else. So all those immigrants who were pioneers going out west, they were all wearing, clothing that was made in New England. They were sleeping on sheets that were woven in New England. Their bedspreads, every single thing was coming from there. It took a hell of a lot of thread. And so the thread spinning was a really big part of it. Also, very often the factories were segregated by product type. So there would be an entire factory, like a whole company, that did nothing but spinning thread. And then there'd be another company down the road that did nothing but weaving the thread. And maybe they were customers of each other, maybe not, they would kind of move the stuff around. Sometimes everything would be in the same building, but that was not always the case at all. So there were companies that specialized in thread, very famous for that. Companies that specialized in blankets, famous for that. For example, West Point Pepperell, that was a big name. They were famous for blankets. Berkshire Hathaway was a famous name. They were famous for fine quality shirt material. That was their original thing. Now we think of them as being this amazing conglomerate, but they started off with this guy. Remember there was the guy with the eye patch? He was called the Hathaway man. Anyway, so each company had a small niche that they tried to dominate. And it took a lot of thread. You're absolutely right. Is there another question?
Ben, how are we doing for time for questions? Can we go a few more minutes?
I think we can go a few more minutes, and then we could. I think there's about two or three more questions, but maybe we could just keep brief answers, and then we could have a general discussion at the end if anyone wants to go off mute. And that sounds good. Thanks, Dana.
Okay. Shall I pick a question, or do you want to do that?
Sure, Steve. If you can see the chat, feel free.
Yeah, I can. I just put it up here. Okay, here's one from Rick. Ask about film processing and printing. I'll be very brief. I was working primarily with 120 roll film, Tri-X, processed primarily in D76, and printed primarily using the Omega system. Initially, I had a smaller one, but then I had the Omega 4x5. So I was doing 4x5 Tri-X, 120 Tri-X. The roll film was processed on reels in tall stainless steel cylinders, usually 6 at a time. The sheets were done in racks. I had like a whole rack thing and these vertical things, and you put it in the rack, and da-da-da-da, bang, bang, in, out, bang, bang. And I had a whole system worked out to do that. And then I did my processing in color. You asked about, I said color, that was a mistake. My processing was all in black and white. I did color work later, but not at this time. So that was kind of a good question. From John, children working on farms, transitioning to mill work. That's a really, really big question. The way that the sort of labor history part, how people left the farms and went into the mills. It's a fascinating subject. And I should add, by the way, anyone who wants to follow this further might go to Lowell, Massachusetts and tour the national park there. Also, you could go to Waltham, Mass, where the Charles River Museum of Industry is. Both are excellent resources. Lowell especially is good at interpreting this movement of labor from farms to mills and onward from there. What do you think, Dana? One more question or what?
Sure. The most important question, where is the best place to get a copy of your book, Run of the Mill?
Okay, there are two places. You can go online because they circulate in the online marketplace. Typically, they're used copies, and they'll tell you like, what condition it's in. Or in special cases, people buy them directly from me. I'm easy to find. You can send the note to me if you want, and we could talk about that. I have a couple of pristine copies left, but not too many. But you can definitely find this book in the online marketplace.
Steve, if you haven't already put up your contact info, if people have further questions for you, maybe you could.
I'll be glad to do that. Do you want me to?
If you type it into the chat, maybe?
Sure. How about I type it in the chat? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
It's really easy. My first name, STEVE, at first name, last name, .com. Did I get that right? I did. Steve at stevedunwell.com.
Okay, great.
And if you can't find me, you're not trying. So I try to be easy to find. So I'm going to wrap up my part there. I think that you guys have some additional discussion. I'll stay around for that a little bit. And I'm going to turn it back to Dana. Once again, I really appreciate PHSNE inviting me to do this. It's a lot of fun for me. I love sharing this subject. I think it is just one of the most fascinating things ever. If I wasn't a professional photographer, I would try to get a PhD in this area because it's really something that just rewards a lot of intense study and dedication. So back to you, Dana.
Thanks. Big hand. Anybody who wants to unmute and applaud, feel free.
Okay, thanks.
And there was another question that I saw from Andrew.
I just wanted to mention that I met you, Steve, a number of years ago, and I'm the one that started the APN at the Boston Society of Architects.
Oh, hello.
And you came and spoke a few times. In fact, we went to your home or your office at one time. Also, another question, another thought for everybody else. I discovered doing genealogy work that a lot of people came over to this country if they worked in the mills, the knitting mills in Paisley and Glasgow area of Scotland. They intentionally came to this area of the country because it was such a big industry.
Yes.
And they had their jobs waiting for them, you know?
Yeah. If I could just speak to that point very briefly, the skilled workers were a special category in the textile industry. And you are absolutely right that quite a few highly skilled workers came directly from, typically from the UK, but from other places as well. And they could just walk up to the mill and say, I know how to weave plaid, or I know how to do lace, an extremely difficult job. And they'd be hired instantly. Say, you're on, go over there, tell Joe I sent you and start today. So they were able to come over. The mule spinners also were a more skilled group. The pattern weavers, the jacquard weavers. There are a lot of highly skilled trades or sectors within the trade where people could come in from other places and just show up and get a job right away. It's a very good point.
Does anyone else have any brief question they would like to ask Steve before we make our final announcements?
I have one brief question. Nowadays, with everybody wearing masks because of another reason, because of the illness, none of the workers with all the lint and particles wore masks in any pictures because that just wasn't done. How did their lungs hold up with all of the dust and particles in the air? It's not a question about photography, but it's a question about their health, and especially with all the child labor back in the early part of the century, of the 19th century.
Yeah, those are good questions, and it reminds me that one of these mill owners said to me that the most significant adversary of the textile industry in the 70s was OSHA, the Occupational Self and Health Administration, because they came in and said, well, you can't do this. You can't have these machines that are unprotected. The air quality has to meet a certain standard. And so what I was seeing was really the last days of the old world, in a way, where these dangerous machines, unshielded, a fair amount of lint in the air, which you'll still find in some cases. And if you went back and you could really look at the medical records, I think you'd find that there was a moderate amount of lung disease. But compared with the really, really bad industries like asbestos, for example, or coal, I think the textile industry was only sort of bad compared to the ones that were really bad.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're getting close to the end of our time. I see Ben nodding. Thank you everyone for the great questions. Thank you for coming. And I did type in just at the very bottom, December, we're going to attempt to have a PHSNE Christmas party virtually. So we'll see how this goes, but there's a link where you can sign up if you'd like to share, like we normally do at our in-person meetings, a camera, a little a print, anything that you think would translate on camera for about 5 minutes. We're going to do a bunch of those, and you can sign up for a slot at that link in the chat. So we look forward to having just a nice social chat back and forth in December instead of a speaker presentation. So Steve, thank you again. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Joel. And I hope everyone will join us in December. Should be interesting. And that's about it for me. Joel, anything you'd like to add?
I think we're all set. Thank everyone for attending. Steve, great job. And we appreciate your professionalism.
My pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.